Welcome to the Driving Change Podcast on the Evergreen Podcast Network, where we live at the intersection of neuroscience and storytelling. If you love great stories and you love understanding the mindset it takes to be a world-class change agent, then join us as our fascinating guests from all walks of life unpack their unique journeys of perseverance and passion, of expertise and experience, and be inspired to use your own story to drive change. Well, welcome back to another episode of the Driving Change Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Bloomfield. Today's guest might be familiar to many of you because if you were listening in a couple seasons ago, we had Dr. Richard Boyatzis on when he was launching his book, Helping People Change, an amazing practitioner book on all things change. And if you haven't read that yet, I encourage you to go back and do that. But Dr. Boyatzis is one of the most influential leaders, thinkers, innovators of our time, quite honestly. He's shaped a lot of the way we think about leadership, emotional intelligence, but he's also really revolutionized how a lot of us think and understand human behavior, in particularly change itself. Now, he's a distinguished university professor at Case Western Reserve. He's a pioneer in emotional and social intelligence. He's authored more than 200 articles, 9 coming up on 10, I think, books. He's one of my favorite books of his. Two of my favorites are he co-authored Primal Leadership with Daniel Goleman and the aforementioned book on helping people change. Both of those are amazing if you haven't read those yet. And just go look him up because you'll find his work is inspiring, but very also simple to understand. That's the other thing I wanted to bring him back on for is it isn't his academic credentials, because a lot of you probably, your eyes will roll back when if I read his resume. It's how he translates complex neuroscience into practical strategies that you can use every day, personally and professionally. And that's what he's really gifted at. That's what I can't wait to talk to him a little bit more about. And this one might be a little bit more scientific even than the last one, to highlight some of the things in his new book, which is a culmination of his life's work called The Science of Change. So welcome back yet again to another episode of the Driving Change Podcast. Dr. Boyatzis, it's an honor to have you.
Thank you, Jeff. Glad to be back.
Now, I can, for a fee, I can go on the road and introduce you with that kind of hype everywhere you want. So you just tell me. I mean, so one of the things we didn't get to know a lot in the first time you were on a couple seasons ago, because we just dove right into the practical application inside the book. I'd like the audience to get to know the personal side a little bit of Dr. Boyatzis. So take us all the way back as far as you'd like. Tell us a little bit about your origin story and your journey here to what ultimately led you to become who you are today.
Well, God created Earth on the first 6 days. And no, sorry.
And Richard on the 8th?
My parents are immigrants from Greece. And my father came over after doing a year and a half of university in Thessaloniki. 1938, and didn't really understand much English, would try to go to the movies on Saturdays to learn English. He was working in his brother's diner, but he got to the US in time took out papers right away. Of course, he came in legally and got drafted. So Pearl Harbor happened, and his company, his battalion, was sent right down to the Panama jungle because they assumed the Japanese would attack that next. So he spent 2 years in the jungles of Panama, and then they moved his battalion up north, getting ready for D-Day. And so because they got sick from moving from the jungle, they didn't arrive on D-Day, but they landed on Normandy beaches weeks later. So he went through France and Germany, and when he gets discharged, by then he had met my mother, who had lived across the street from his brother, her family. They'd gotten married, and he knew he couldn't go back to school. And so he did what every Greek male I knew on this side of the Atlantic did, which was basically every adult male I knew. We're all Greek. He went into the restaurant business. So my father was a waiter, first at the Champs-Élysées on Fifth Avenue, and then at the Tavern on the Green for 25 years. And, worked his way up to captain and all that. But in the process, we lived in a small apartment, 1 bedroom in Queens on the other side of the 59th Street Bridge. And it was all brick apartment buildings, working class neighborhood, mostly at that point Jewish. There were a few non-Jewish families, but not too many. And it was the kind of neighborhood where if you wanted to play outside, you were playing in the street, and usually with, a red Spalding and a broomstick, stickball, because there were a few trees on our block, but they were down by the railroad tracks and they were all dead, by the way. So I'm going to PS 150 for kindergarten, elementary school. And my father had really insisted that they only speak Greek at home, he and my mother. So my mother didn't start speaking English at home until after my sister was born, 3 years later. And then at the beginning of kindergarten, my uncle had died, and my father didn't want to tell his mother over a telegram. So he packed up the family, and we took a steamship to Le Havre, and then a train to Paris, and then spent, I think, 1 or 2 nights in Paris, and then took the Orient Express to Thessaloniki and spent the better part of 4 or 5 months there. I get back, and I mean, I spoke Greek, as my cousins often remind me. It was a child's Greek, but it was Greek. And in fact, I could read parts of Greek, but I couldn't read English. And when I did speak English, I spoke with a slight accent. So by the time we got back, they wanted to leave me back from kindergarten, because in those years, in 1951, if you had those issues, you were considered somewhat retarded. It was before multiculturalism was popular. And that was the beginning of 3 times in which they tried to leave me back because they thought I was cognitively slow. Each time my mother would keep me out of school for anywhere from 2 to 6 weeks, bring me up to speed, send me back in. And in the process, she would hammer away at how they were out to get me. Xenos, they're foreigners. You can't trust any of these North Americans, anybody with light eyes or light hair, anybody who was actually not from Greece. So any other country were evil people that would rob me, steal. And about 1 out of every 3 times I'd go out to play, I would get beat up. So it wasn't odd that I didn't.
You're getting reinforced.
There's a certain face validity. Yeah. But what happened was she just kept hammering away that I had to promote myself, that I had to sell myself, that I had to stand up for myself, because not only wouldn't others do it, but they would try to take my ideas and credit for anything I did. Flash forward another 6 years. My mother and father decided it'd be nice to have a little house and in a little bit different kind of neighborhood. So we moved out in the middle of Nassau County, to a working class community called East Meadow. And it worked out okay. My father worked every day, 7 days a week, from 3 in the afternoon to 3 in the morning, because the Tavern on the Green was one of the noted jazz supper clubs during those eras. But it was okay, because he was commuting opposite to traffic on the Long Island Expressway, which had just been finished. And that's where I went to, I finished elementary school, then junior high school and high school. Well, in 1957, after Sputnik went up, they tested everybody in the US, every kid in every grade. And as I'm beginning 6th grade, my mother gets a note from my teacher, "I'd like to see, Mr. and Mrs. Boyatzis, you would come in for a meeting." And my mother went to all these meetings because my father was working the whole time. So she went. Years later, she told me when she got the note, she rolled her eyes and thought, "Oh, this again."
Right. This
time, Mr. McCaffrey, my 6th grade teacher, surprised her. He said, "The testing we did for all the children last May?" She said, "Yes." He said, "It turns out your son is really smart." She said, "Oh, I knew that." And he said, No, I mean, he's really smart, especially in math and physics. And we'd like to offer you an option. You can either skip him 2 grades or have him join this new experimental program where he'll do junior high school and high school plus 2 years of college in 6 years." And she said, well, she didn't have to think about it much. She went for that option because she knew I was a little bit geeky and I spent a lot of time reading, and she thought I was a bit socially immature anyway, which was true. And I had a phenomenal education. So the public school system that I went to in East Meadow, I mean, out of my graduating class of 600, 5 of us went to MIT. You know,
Oh,
others
wow.
went to other schools like Harvard,
Yeah.
Princeton, or Berkeley, and things like that. Well, in the process of growing up, because I basically read a lot, because that was what I could do. And then my father bought us a small TV somewhere around 1949 or something. And so I'd sometimes watch these serials. I fell in love with space. I wanted to go in the space program. And given, my scores and all the rest of it, it seemed like a pretty fitting thing. I had taken 2 years of advanced physics and 2 years of calculus in high school. So I ended up applying to MIT for the aeronautics and astronautics program on the space work, and I got in. But my parents couldn't really help me out financially. Fortunately, I got a little bit of scholarship. I've been doing a lot of band work, been playing in, we had a small band. We didn't do rock and roll things. I think we did 2 out of 70 paying gigs. Mostly it was dances, Italian weddings, VFW
Right.
dances. So I'd saved enough of that to pay for a year at MIT, but that was it. And so I go to MIT, I'm in the program, and I hit my junior year and I'm tapped out. The government would not lend me any more money. Had surpassed the total amount loanable. MIT couldn't loan me anymore. No bank would. And the aeronautics and astronautics department that I was in, because my specialty was control systems of interplanetary vehicles, got me a job doing what I was being trained to work in the space design issues for Northrop Norair. 2 of my fraternity brothers were in a similar boat. They got jobs at Northrop, but in different divisions. So I worked in the experimental gas dynamics research unit. And this department, we were working on at the time in 1966, booster designs. We were competing. Northrop was competing against Boeing. Boeing won the shuttle design, and occasionally having to fix things that were going on in Vietnam with the F-5. But in the process, this department, this research, it was one of 2 research departments. Everybody in the department was anywhere from really smart to scary smart. I mean, this was 2 departments of Sheldon's. And that included the managers. And all of us were weird. There was one guy who kind of was normal, but nobody else was normal. I don't want to go into all the stories about the weirdness, but remembering the fact that the managers were just as bad. And working in the space program meant sitting in a cubicle and computer programming all day. And I was programming the optimum size of the outlets for the portholes, if you will, on the reentry vehicle. And, the shape and size and all that. What was very clear after almost 5.5 months of that is there's no way I was going to do that for the rest of my life. They wouldn't let me into space, which I'd already pushed because I wore glasses. So we're driving back to MIT. I've got 2 courses, technical courses I have to take to finish in my degree, and I'm much too compulsive not to, which I did. But I had all these other courses that I would open. Now I did take another technical course as an elective, but most of the courses I decided I would take something else. What was I going to do? I didn't want to go into the restaurant business. I did that for a number of summers. I didn't see a future in that. They had offered us jobs. I mean, they thought we were doing a great job, and Northrop offered us jobs as soon as we graduated. I didn't want to do it. And my music work was good, but I didn't think I had enough to really go pro. So I said, I know, I'll go in management. Look at these idiots we had at Northrop. So the Sloan School, the management school at MIT, had a thing where each semester professors would get up in one big meeting and describe their courses that didn't have any prerequisites. So if you wanted to start taking courses, you could. There were 8 of them that described their courses, as I recall, in this one session we went to. And one of them was a young fellow named Dave Kolb, who later became famous for his work on experiential learning theory. he was finishing. He hadn't quite finished his PhD at Harvard, but he had a faculty position at MIT. And he described his course when he got up to describe it, and it sounded like utter hogwash. It was in organizational psychology. But he said two words that made me run to his basement classroom to get in. No tests. It turns out I was test phobic. I had been all my life. And I did well on tests. Actually really well, but I should have done really much better, given the way I really did in terms of my capability. But anyway, and it was in that class that a couple things happened. I started to discover the field of psychology, which was like, oh my God. And I said to him, I wanted to do my term paper on how managers didn't help their subordinates. And he said, well, we have some real data on how our 28 to 30-year-old MBAs are helping or not helping each other. Do you want to use real data? I said, of course. So I worked my ass off for that term paper. He liked what I'd started. He offered me a job for the summer. We ended up publishing the paper. But in the meantime, going into my senior year, he introduced me to people who I later learned were giants in the field. Ed Schein. I took 2 PhD seminars from him while I was a senior. I took 2 from Everett Hagen, who created the Psychoanalytic Historical Society with Erik Erikson. If you've ever read Gandhi's Truth or Young Man Luther, or any of those books. And one on social change from Dave McClellan, who was on sabbatical from Harvard, and another one on economics. And in the process, what I discovered was, as long as I wore, because in those days, if you went to graduate courses, you wore a coat and tie. As long as I wore a coat and tie, everybody else in the class, in the seminars, thought I was a PhD student. I was a senior.
Right.
Except the professors, because they were the ones who knew I couldn't write a sentence, because I basically was trained in formulas. But Dave Cole became a mentor, Ed Schein became a mentor, and a few others. And by December of that year, they talked me into considering going to graduate school, which I hadn't thought of. They explained to me what came next, because I didn't know. And then the coup de grace was they convinced me I should go in psychology, not management, because I had a special talent. And by then, I was absolutely enthralled with the field of psychology.
The psychology couldn't be any further afield from your analytical, data-driven experience in life at that point, right, in many ways, right? And so was that why you think you were so attracted to it? Because it was an unknown to you? Like it was almost like bizarrely unknown to you compared to what you could tangibly wrap your head around?
I would think that. And I used to say, I went from outer space to inner space. Not really. The real story is that everybody was so concerned about beating the Russians in the space race that they focused on my math and physics ability. They didn't notice that throughout high school, I was in multiple clubs. I was usually an officer. I had a series of bands, but we played a lot every weekend. I always had at least one, if not sometimes 2 or 3 girlfriends at the same time. I was very social. Nobody noticed that because they were so focused on my technical ability. So, and I grew up in a Greek culture, which was very relational.
Right.
And if anything, it was always interesting to me to see some of my classmates whose parents were either Jewish or Swedish or Polish or came from other countries, or their parents did, how different they related to each other. So I was actually pretty interested in people. What I hadn't thought of is that it was a serious field of endeavor.
Right.
And, coming from where I did in both the culture as the rest of it, the whole idea of psychology was not exactly seen as a serious endeavor. I mean, even for 3 years just before my father died, after I finished my PhD, my father would introduce me to his and my mother's Greek friends at the Greek church in Brockton, Mass, as his son who got a degree in aeronautics and astronautics at MIT. He'd leave off the PhD because it was in psychology.
Right.
And also he left it off because it was from Harvard, which was then, in those days, seen as a den of pinko leftist thought, which it still is, actually. But anyway.
I was going to say then.
yeah, right. It still is. But anyway. but MIT and engineering and science was real. So that just gives you some of the context.
That's brilliant, because I think it helps me understand now is, gosh, your passion then in the rest of your career around the scientific study side of psychology into neuroscience, all your aerospace and your analytical thinking, it all makes sense now. It all kind of crescendoed into that, right?
I'm a scientist. I'm a nerd.
Yeah.
And I love that stuff. But it is true that in the spring of 1967 is when I started working on the early version of this theory, the intentional change theory. And the new book that you mentioned is an integration of 58 years of my work on how we pursue sustained desired change at all levels, from individual to country change.
So let's jump off there, because I think that a lot of times we bring in somebody like yourself. I love that. I tease Dan a lot about this too, is that a lot of PhDs talk about everything has a theory at the end of it. Like, at some point, does anyone prove any of these things? I'm just kidding. We call everything a theory. But once you've proven it, is it no longer a theory? So explain intentional change theory in kind of layman's terms to folks.
Well, one of the principles is that sustained desired change. So I don't care what you do for a few weeks or a few months, what lasts for a year. And it has to be desired. Sustained desired change for individuals or couples or families or teams or organizations, communities, countries, does not happen in a smooth, linear way. It happens in discontinuities. And those discontinuities turn out to be, it's almost never a normal distribution. I published a paper a few years ago with a colleague, Udayan Dar, showing that change is almost always a power curve, which means all of our assumptions about normal distributions just aren't real. And to appreciate that, you have to use complexity theory. And you have to be ready to adjust for the fact that people don't change in a smooth way. It's always got fits and starts. Second, using complexity theory, when you ask the question, when people engage in our achieving sustained desired change, are there moments of emergence or emergence into consciousness that are consistent when you study a lot of groups of people? And the answer to that is yes. One discovery is of your purpose, your vision. And in collectives, in teams, organizations, communities, it's what's the shared vision. Not goals, vision. It turns out neurologically is a huge difference. Vision, purpose, meaning. If you have that, you're eligible for the second, which is your real, what I call the real self. Now, it's not what you think of yourself, because that's delusional. The real self is, how do other people experience you? And that usually leads to a comparison, even unconsciously, to the ideal self. And you come up with a personal balance sheet, strengths, weaknesses. Then you have a learning agenda as the third discovery, which is something you would joyously want to be pursuing. As soon as you use the word should or have to, it's not. It's negative. But it's something you are really looking forward to. It's never a performance improvement plan. That's illusionary. And it usually is something that gets you closer to your vision, sometimes using your strengths. May or may not include working on a weakness. The fourth discovery is once you're on a path practicing. And the fifth discovery are these caring relationships that enable you to move through all this. Now, what enables you to move through these different phases of change are what I call tipping points. And these are psychophysiological states that put you into a state where you're open to considering an alternative, what I call the positive emotional attractor, or the negative emotional attractor where you close down. That happens, again, individually, in teams, organizations, communities, countries. Lastly, because my theory, intentional change theory, many parts of which have been validated through many different research studies, as you mentioned, Jeff, but there are always parts of it that haven't been. And part of it is it's a fractal. So I believe the process of change at the country level, at the community level, is identical to what I'm talking about. But when you have a fractal theory at multiple levels, you have to have something that can move information, and I think among humans, emotion across the levels. And that's where the role of resonant leadership relationships become key, and social identity groups. Now, that's a bit more comprehensive and more abstract than to delve into, but suffice to say, you don't change at one level without changes happening at other levels. And very often when people try to change individually or team or organization, and they don't work on the multiple levels at the same time, the change is squelched. That's why part of it, why it's not sustainable.
So let's have some fun with this then, because I think I love thinking about this. And I love your concept of shared vision, and you get the personal change and the personal change experience, and you got the the organizational and the complexity theory. The bigger, the more brains involved in the change, the more complex it can become. Because we're coming on the heels of this another amazing. I think we're constantly in campaign mode in our country, in the United States. You talked about country level change. How does this affect or apply in a situation where you talk about country level change, when you have two entirely groups of different people who have clearly, apparently, two completely different goals, aspirations, and vision for what the country should look like? How does a country ultimately come to change that's positive when you have that kind of conflicting change management happening at the country level?
It's not all that complicated. It doesn't.
Okay, fair enough.
So I don't think we as a country will pull together for at least another 30 years. Part of it is we have had a litany for the better part of the last 30 years of leaders who are not resonant. And right now our two major candidates are both demagogues. They appeal to their inside group, and they hate the outside group, and the outside group hates them, and they're both doing that. So right now we've got two demagogues running for office who are not breeding shared vision. And I know periodically somebody comes along, Barack Obama came along and said hope and change. Well, he only meant hope and change for one group of people with one philosophy. Joe Biden said he was the great uniter. He only united one group of people, refused to talk to anybody who disagreed with him. Now we know why. He couldn't comprehend it cognitively. But the fact is that because we have such polarized politics, which I blame the two-party system, the two-party system forces it. So what's going to happen is we will show some change, but not at a national level. What's going to happen is we'll show pockets of change where resonant leadership emerges, where people kind of move ahead in certain domains. So we are seeing in certain domains, some business leaders just are amazing in their positive emotional contagion and creating whole new fields. We will see, as we're continuing to see, some leaders in the arts, music, sports, and other fields. But it's going to be little pockets. Now, fortunately, little pockets will be important enough so they'll find a vaccine for COVID, and they'll move us ahead in terms of some important pieces of literature and movies and things like that. But I don't think as an entity, we're going to come together, for a long time, because we have to wait for somebody to emerge as a leader who actually does see the whole. And right now, it's nobody.
And I think this all goes in part, and we can bring it back down to the individual level. But the thing that I really love studying on with marrying the neuroscience with the psychology here is you can see the leadership style, the resonant leadership style of, it's almost like people, whether they know it intentionally or not, they know the psychology of risk of loss and loss aversion, and they know how to use fear. They know how to create the negative emotional attractors to get the reaction positively from their group and negatively from another group. And again, whether they're doing it intentionally or not, right?
I quoted a line from in one of my LinkedIn posts last month. I quoted a line from my first chapter. I said, "Are we on a cataclysmic path toward oblivion?" The doomsayers would tell us we are. But in the process, what they're doing is catering to arousing fear and defensiveness, which makes us vulnerable to their manipulation.
Wow, that's so good.
And that's the biggest threat. And it doesn't matter which side of this thing you're on, whether you're red or blue, whether you're independent, it doesn't matter. The fact is that when we're in the presence of a lot of fear mongering, what the people doing it are trying to manipulate us to be scared into backing into them. But the reality is, the test of it, here's a good test. Is it a demagogue or not? Do they listen to people and bring advisors around themselves who have very different points of view? Do you know the last president in the United States who had members of his cabinet who disagreed with some of his major policies? And not only did they disagree, but in the cabinet meetings, they actually talked about the disagreement. It was Ronald Reagan.
Okay. I would have gone back further even, so that's good.
Well, he was the last one who did that. He actually did it when he was governor, because I was in California when he got elected.
Yeah.
But prior to that, it was FDR in his second term of office, not afterwards or before, second term. Prior to that, it was FDR. I mean, not FDR, Theodore Roosevelt. So it's fairly rare.
And I think if you take this down to the individual level, then as you get into the science behind this,
right?
I'm having this discussion with myself all day long, right? So I'm propagandizing myself half the time, right? I'm the devil angel. You get all the different analogies. So when it comes to you said the word, and I love your expression. It has to be desired change.
Right.
We all want something better for ourselves and our family and our life, but do we desire that we are the ones who change to get it? And what's the science behind that lack of ability to do that for folks?
So what's very clear from the neuroscience studies that we've been doing in the hormonal studies is, and this caused me to reverse a major part of my theory, because I published something in 1970 said that specific goal setting will motivate change. We now know unequivocally that's not true. That except for people with a high unconscious drive called need for achievement, who tend to be people in sales, who like the game. They don't actually really give a damn about their clients or the products. They love the game. They love the measurement.
Like to win.
Except for people with that syndrome. The rest of the population is not interested in specific goals. And in fact, when you have a specific goal, you activate a neural network that gets people to focus, which is the purpose of a goal. The problem is it suppresses the network that allows you to be open to a new idea or people. So as soon as you go analytic on a goal or trying to focus on a problem, you're inhibiting, you're suppressing openness to new ideas and openness to other people. So the whole idea of inclusiveness is destroyed when we go analytic. The whole idea of innovation and adaptation is destroyed when we go analytic prematurely. Of course, goals are useful in a change process, but really much, much later in the process. And it's at the point where you've eliminated, where you can focus and you've eliminated all the other possibilities. So what is it that drives change? Vision. It's purpose, it's meaning, it's the big picture stuff. And when you do this with other people and talk about the vision, the sense of purpose, the real meaning, it's amazing. It lights up the circuitry that makes you open to new ideas. So you're able to think of new creative ideas, be more adaptive, be more sensitive to others. And now, it's not that one is good and the other is bad. We need both to function.
Right.
But the question is, can we go back and forth? And very often, we're socialized into only taking one approach. So how many times have you been consulting to organizations where people say, well, let's motivate these executives by giving them another metric and putting another metric on their dashboard? That is sheer idiocy, because that is now ensured that they won't innovate on the path to change. They might do everything they're doing now a little faster, but they're not going to notice when their competition makes a big change. They're not going to notice if all of a sudden the technology changes. So the challenge that we have around being open in the sense of considering change is, how do we kind of affect our mindset?
So I have a farm boy theory on this, and I want to run it past you. My papaw, he was Mr., tell a story and explain something simply. I feel like, having studied a lot of this, not to your extent, what happens is when people talk about vision, when people talk about purpose, when people talk about those things, they become ambiguous, and I can't wrap my arms around them. So I don't think I can quantify them. So therefore I can't define them. So therefore I can't understand them. But if I talk about something that activates the analytical network, I can measure it, I can see it, I can define it, I can categorize it. Therefore I must understand it better. Therefore I must be able to activate towards it with more fervor. My theory is that that's why people gravitate toward those things, even though they're not helpful and they don't actually drive change, where the other is a little bit more ambiguous.
I agree with you fully. And the research that supports what you called your farm boy logic is that as humans, there are a number of things that are basic tendencies. One, our bodies will help us survive. So our brains will go into mode to make sure we keep breathing, and instead of learning. So survival ends up being something built into our design. Secondly, we on the whole are social animals. We're going to look for belonging and want to minimize the risk of social disapproval or standing out. Well, you can't innovate without standing out. So right away, you're realizing you're closing down a lot of innovation. And third, in many cultures, people want to reduce the uncertainty. That's not true of all cultures, but in many cultures, you want to reduce the uncertainty. So I know from having studied the achievement motive, this unconscious drive that's so prevalent in successful salespeople, not salespeople, but successful ones. Same thing with successful entrepreneurs worldwide. And what's very clear is that they see a good percentage of success as 50%. How many people see moderate risk as losing the same number of times you win? If you ask people what's moderate risk, they'd say, oh, well, succeeding 4 out of 5 times. That's not. That's low risk.
Right.
So the idea of reducing uncertainty, of belonging and having more social approval, and of being defensive and surviving results in inhibition toward innovation. Why do we have phrases like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it? What a ridiculous thing to say. How do we grow if we don't come up with new things? Now, we know we have to adapt from our cells. Our cells have to change every so many years, every cell in your body, to our organizations, to our countries, to our communities. If we don't keep adapting, we're not going to be around. So the interesting dilemma is, and yet we have all of these forces that hold us back from innovation. And I think it's why most attempts at change are so bad. Consulting and leadership training, maybe $125 billion a year industry. It shows about an 11% improvement when it's at its best on the things that predict effectiveness in leadership and management, and that atrophies within 3 to 6 weeks.
Man, we stink at what we do then, Richard. What are we doing here?
Yes, we do. What we are is really good salespeople. And well, higher education is just as bad. It's just as bad. I mean, the average half-life for a required course in like accounting for a top 20 ranked MBA program was found to be 6.5 weeks. That's how long people could remember what they themselves produced on a test. So if education and training are so bad, and we know we don't do it by ourselves because New Year's resolutions are ridiculous.
Right.
What it basically says is we're kind of trotting along. And thanks to the fact that periodically somebody comes along and creates the iPhone, or somebody comes along and creates, a Tesla, or somebody comes along and creates music like Beyonce or Taylor Swift, because they're breakouts.
Yeah.
But on the whole, we live under a restrictive, more conservative ethos. And that makes change really difficult.
And I think, and I'd love for you to kind of summarize all this for us and then give us some practical tools and tips here. But I feel like you just mentioned some folks we call innovators. You could look at throughout history at a handful of folks who did the same thing. I feel like we're all capable of that, but we're fighting our own biology, physiology, and psychology with all the things that you attributed to. So knowing that we're fighting that, which is why there's an 11% improvement in those who do leadership development and training and coaching, what can be done and what should be done to improve that?
Right. Well, the first thing is to recognize the science and to say, okay, if vision, purpose is the driver of sustained change, then shouldn't we be talking about that and reminding ourselves of our purpose on a regular basis? So, concrete. I think every manager or executive or leader who has a staff meeting or a project meeting should begin each meeting with some discussion of their purpose, not their goals, their purpose. Why are we doing this? So it could be 5 minutes, could be 6 minutes, something about the values, something about a positive story of a client or a customer that was helped, some way to get at the thing that says to people, we're not here to make budget, we're here to help people. We're here to create new products. We're here to make sure that everybody's got comfortable, safe shoes. Purpose, vision. That's key. So it's not just coming up with it, which, by the way, is not the responsibility of the head person. It has to come from everybody if it's going to be truly inspirational. But reminding people of it on a regular basis. So you start with a discussion of it. You tell stories about customers that were really happy or satisfied. You highlight people who have been heroes in innovation. These are a bunch of things you can do. And if you kick off every meeting with 5 to 8 minutes of that, the rest of your hour is going to go a lot more effectively when you do look at variances.
And I think you're probably going to get into that. You probably get into this in your book, but by doing that, you're suppressing, if I'm not mistaken, you're suppressing the analytical network, yes, and then you're activating the emotional empathic network, and you're elevating the right neurochemistry to be in order for us not only to be inspired, but willing to be innovative.
Yeah. So then when you go into the budget variance, or why did we have this problem with losing sales to this competitor, and you have to go into the analytic mode, you actually start into the analytic mode open.
Yes.
So your problem identification, your problem solving will be a lot better. So that's one thing.
Okay.
Second, really effective leaders understand that leadership is not something a person does. It's a relationship. You can't be a leader without followers, kind of a definition. And just because people report to you does not mean they're following you. I mean, they might be spitting in your coffee that they bring to you. You just don't know.
Right.
So the issue for people in leadership positions, whether it's the head of an organization, a project team, or a family, is how do you build the relationships? Well, it has to involve talking, not exchanging texts, talking. And then it's not talking about problems, it's talking about what's funny, what's going well, what's intriguing, what's puzzling, what's worrying. So I think what our studies to date have shown is that working vision and purpose and working the quality of the relationships are the two levers that people have to make the discussions more creative and healthier.
And in your new book, so Helping People Change, you get into a lot of detail around what that looks like practically. Right. And then in your new book, The Science of Change, you're really explaining almost from an academic level why the science matters when it comes to this. Is that right?
It's not almost, it is from an academic level. I mean, The Science of Change was written for scholars and professionals. And by professionals, I mean usually those people in various fields that have enough formal education or enough reflection that they want to be sensitive to the difference between the wheat and the chaff.
So there's a lot more 3 and 4 cell.
I was going to say the other thing in Shinola, but that's inappropriate. So So the issue is for the discerning professional, it really behooves you to know, what do we know versus what's the hype? And what I've done in this book is not just integrate 58 years of my work. I mean, I freaked out my editor at Oxford University Press when I handed in the manuscript on February 2nd, because the references were 100 pages.
Oh my God.
So it's a lot of other people's studies.
Right.
But it really tears apart some of these myths, like the 10,000 hours of practice, which Gladwell took that from, and I was reading the actual source article when I went back and said, no, who talked about that 10,000 hours? It was Malcolm Gladwell. Well, the original article he was reporting was a really good one. It was a set of scientific studies. But what he didn't really emphasize was the 10,000 hours was their retrospective statement about how long they'd practiced since they were a kid. And it was for people who achieved international competition-winning symphonic pianists.
Well, I mean,
now most of us don't aspire to that level.
I was going to say, what's it?
And plus there's a distortion. There's a distortion in terms of how many hours you really did practice. So what it says is, yes, practice is important, but does it have to be 10,000 hours? No. It's probably going to be 1,000, 2,000 hours for certain abilities.
Depends on what you're trying to become or do, right? It depends
That's right.
on the skill of the behavior, the habit that you're trying to reinforce. Yeah. So what you're telling me in the layman's terms is helping people change. Go get it if you haven't read that yet. It's practitioner oriented. The Science of Change has a lot more 3 and 4 syllable words in it.
Yeah. And the other way to say it, helping people change will help you sweep the floor. Science of Change will get you in the corners.
Oh, okay. Okay. For those of us who like the corners, that's your book.
That's right.
Well, this has been wonderful again. It's great to see you again. I think this is going to be our audience loved your first episode. I think this will take them on an even deeper level and deeper journey. If you're out there, we have a lot of fans of neuroscience and behavioral psychology, just even armchair wise, just love this stuff. And so you are the godfather in so many ways in a lot of this stuff. And so we thank you for being on here and updating us on your work, your new book, and can't wait. It's going to be coming out in just a few weeks from when this episode launches.
And actually, from what the publishers tell me, if you pre-ordered it on Amazon, you'll get it closer to the first week in October than the October 22nd, which it says on the website on Amazon.
Excellent. So you just took the words out of my mouth. I was going to tell folks right now, if they haven't pre-ordered it yet, go pre-order that thing now and and go learn some more. So thank you again, and we'll have you back on again as the time rolls by to give us another update in the next season of your life.
Good. Thanks, Jeff. Bye-bye.